Today's video does contain some disturbing subject matter, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And as always, my friends, thank you. I have a short but pretty terrifying event that happened to me about 4 years ago. I had just moved into my new apartment, and it wasn't in the greatest part of town. It wasn't like it was riddled with crime and scary to be in. It was just an area that was a bit lower income, really. The best way to describe it is somewhere in between pretty decent and a tad sketchy, if that literally makes any sense. I will mention that I am not white, and while I don't like to play the race card for anything, I'm pretty certain that this had something to do with the situation that played out. Like I said, I had just moved into a new apartment, and it was actually my second night living there. I was watching TV and I had this idea that I should go buy some ice cream to celebrate moving in. You have to treat yourself every once in a while, right? Just celebrate those little milestones and everything. It was a brisk night walk to the store, quiet and peaceful. Little did I know that the trip back was going to be the complete opposite of the walk there. I walked back on the same path that I took to get to the store, except this time I was carrying a bag with a tub of rocky road. A bit into the walk, I noticed a group of 3 guys standing up ahead. At first, I thought they were just some guys out enjoying the evening like I was, until they turned toward me and started walking. I tried to avoid being paranoid, thinking it was just good timing, and that they were just randomly heading in my direction. It became pretty quickly apparent that they weren't just heading in my direction, they had intentions. They very quickly stopped me and had me backed up against a wall. Initially, I thought this was a mugging. I told them that I didn't want any trouble, and I put my hands up, basically saying, "Take what you want to take, I won't fight back." Mostly because it was 3 guys, at least one of them with a gun, and me armed with nothing but a container of Rocky Road ice cream. I assumed that they would take my wallet, probably my cell phone, and maybe even my ice cream, and that they would just run off and that would be that. But, of course, it was actually much worse than that. The leader, I'm assuming, or at least the guy with the gun, barked at me to drop the bag. I did. He then told me to get down on my knees, and, well, I did what he asked. He told the other 2 guys to pat me down, which was weird, but I wasn't going to question the guy that literally had my life in his hands. They patted me down, and one of them said that I was clear, whatever that meant. But then it got even weirder. One of the other 2 grabbed my hands and pulled them behind my back and then cuffed me. My mind immediately went to, are these some kind of rogue police officers? I actually summoned the courage to ask them why I was being arrested, and the leader just told me to shut up. No more than a couple of seconds later, the area was lit with flashing red and blues, as a car pulled up to the scene. The car parked, and I heard a stern voice shout, "What the hell is going on here?" The guys responded in a manner that was far from scared or concerned. The one just saying something along the lines of, "Don't worry, Sheriff, we got him taken care of." Apparently this was the wrong thing to say to the sheriff, as he lost it. He told all 3 of them to get on the ground, and immediately called in for backup. The 3 guys started yelling at the sheriff about how they were helping and how I was one of them. Again, whoever them was, and saying that they were helping him. The sheriff told them they were a bunch of idiots, and yelled that the one guy needed to drop his weapon and they all needed to get on the ground right then. The whole time, I'm just sitting there on the ground, hands behind my back, thinking, I really chose a bad night to get ice cream. When the other officers arrived, They swiftly handled the faux cops while the sheriff uncuffed me and asked if I was alright. I told him that I had no idea what was going on, and he confessed that he was just as baffled as I was. He told me the obvious and mentioned that those guys were not cops, and he was clearly just as confused about their endgame as I was. He offered to take me back to my apartment, and when we got there, he took my statement. He promised me that he would see to it that those guys would face the consequences of their actions, and then followed that up by suggesting, with genuine concern, that it may be safer for me to avoid late-night strolls in the area. With the guys' comments of me being one of them, and the way he said that, it told me all I needed to know. I told him that I understood. He offered me his business card and then told me to call him if I ever had any trouble. I was shaken, of course, but at least I knew that someone out there was looking out for me in this crazy part of town. Looking back, that night could have gone much worse. If the sheriff hadn't pulled up right when he had, I can only imagine what those guys were going to do or what their next step was. I was completely defenseless. And honestly, if that guy had wanted me dead, I think that I would have been dead. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and I'm grateful that the timing was on my side. While I have had to deal with people like them a few times since that night, it's never been anything that terrifying or life-threatening. I still live in the same apartment, and thankfully most of my neighbors are friendly. I will say that this lovely welcoming party did go away for some pretty serious crimes. And of course, the guy with the gun was a felon, so he shouldn't have had the weapon in the first place. Also, when I go to the store now, I drive. No more late-night walks to get my rocky road. Have you ever experienced something so unnerving and inexplicably bizarre that it makes you question yourself and everything around you? That's a dramatic way of telling you about what happened to me on the night that this event happened. The whole thing really gives me the creeps just thinking about it, and rewriting it out makes me feel a bit ill, but I think it's a story that's honestly worth telling. Some people may hear my story and think, oh, that's not that bad, nothing really happened to you. Which, sure, it could have been worse, but in my opinion, it's those possibilities and unanswered bits that make this whole thing so much creepier than it needed to be. I work the late shift. Not the overnight shift, just the late shift, which means I get home at a super awkward time. Because of this, I need to find or make time to do things for me. Things that I enjoy or to keep me happy and healthy. One thing that I love doing is going for long walks, and thankfully, since I get home when everyone else is in bed, I get to enjoy the cool summer nights all to myself. I found that the empty roads at midnight really make for a nice backdrop for those walks that you need to take to clear your mind. And as such, I've made them part of my daily ritual. The stillness of the town really adds some contrast to the overall heat of the day. Walking at nights can be a pain in the winter, but in the summers, it's heavenly. On one particular night, about halfway into my usual route, I noticed that there was a familiar glow of headlights hitting me from behind, and brightening up everything to my left. Initially, I didn't really mind it. It happens as cars pass, and while it's not terribly common on my walks, it's not unheard of. However, where normally the car would pass me within a few seconds of illuminating my path, I noticed that whatever car was behind me was not passing. I kept walking, just staring at my shadow being cast onto the road from the lights, until it had been probably a couple of minutes, which made me start to feel a bit uneasy and confused. I started thinking about it and figured that it was possible that the car had pulled over, or maybe it was an officer that was tailing me to ask me if I was okay. Again, it was midnight, and I was a fairly small woman walking on the side of the road. I decided to go ahead and turn around to see who it was. When I did, I think it made the situation that much worse. It wasn't a cop or a car on the side of the road. It was an ice cream truck, moving at a pace that was uncannily slow for a vehicle just driving on the road. At this point, I was more or less certain that whoever was driving this thing was following me. Not just driving on the slow or going at a leisurely pace, they were driving slow with intent. The whole vibe of the situation was enough to set off a flurry of alarm bells in my head. Why the hell would an ice cream truck be out at midnight? And why was it following me like this? My sense of unease skyrocketed when, after a few more steps of me walking backwards and just staring at the truck, they abruptly shut off the headlights and turned on the music. The street was completely dark at this point, save the overhead streetlights that were randomly placed. But I could still see the truck and the bright colors of the clown and ice cream cones painted on it. Enough was enough. My instincts were screaming at me to get away from this situation. I paused for a second, pulled out my cell phone from my pocket, and started walking back the way I came. I started recording the truck and yelling, "Why are you following me? Who the hell are you?" Trying to just be loud and obnoxious. Either this person was going to jump out and grab me, or they were going to drive off when they realized they were being recorded. I made it very clear that I was recording and trying to get a shot of the driver. I started screaming about having 911 on the line, and that I was filming him for the police. As soon as I said this, the truck's engine suddenly revved up and it sped off, screeching its tires right in front of me and leaving me in the distance. At no point during him driving off did he turn the headlights back on either, which, again, cemented that this was an odd occurrence. After he was out of sight, I was left just standing there with my heart racing and a mix of relief and fear coursing through my veins. I know that my response to this person was not one that others would ever recommend, but I really didn't know what else to do. If I ran, and they were going to grab me, they would have just sped up and chased me. It was the middle of the night, so going to any of the nearby houses wasn't really a solution. In the end, I decided to be big and loud, like I was dealing with a bear, and it worked. Looking back, though, I cannot shake off those unsettling questions. Why were they tailing me? What were the driver's intentions, and how much danger was I actually in? The logical part of me struggles to find a rational explanation, but I guess it's easy to speculate, if nothing else. I still enjoy my late-night walks, but I've taken a different approach to my safety, and let's just say that I can defend myself if it ever were to come to it. I never advocate violence, but I do advocate for being able to keep yourself safe. If nothing else, this event has left me with a bit of a heightened sense of vigilance. Always be aware of your surroundings, and never let your guard down, even when something is seemingly routine, because you never know when that routine will be broken by something unexpected. This happened about 4 years back, in the early summer of 2019. My wife and I had just purchased our first home, a quaint little 2-bedroom home in the older part of town. It wasn't too fancy, but we were proud of it and we had made a ton of plans on what we were going to do with it, both inside and out. The street that we lived on was lined with maple trees, and it was honestly beautiful. It was aptly named, too. We lived on Maple Street. Most of the neighbors were kind enough, mostly just older folks that kept to themselves. But there was one house on the block that was a bit different. The one across the street and slightly to the left, which in this case was 405 Maple Street. Something about the house always seemed to emit this creepy vibe. It was a weather-beaten, old structure with paint peeling off like aged skin. The window stared blankly, like the house had eyes and was just staring off into the ether. The house was actually empty, or was supposed to be. The old man that had lived there had passed away a few years ago, and no one seemed willing to move into the house. As an aside, there was a for sale sign when we moved into the house, but after a year or two, they removed it, and the house is just sat empty. Anyway, about a month into living in our new home, I started to notice some oddities about that house. Firstly, it was empty, and sometimes when I would look outside, I would see the lights turn on or off. Of course, this could just be squatters, but in our town that didn't make a whole lot of sense. So, I assumed more likely that it was just some rowdy kids or something like that. The strange thing about it was that there were no curtains, so when the lights were on, you would think you would see an intruder. But there wasn't anyone there. It would just be a light turning on in an empty room. Then, when I would be walking my dog, Mac, I would notice shadows around the house. I know that sounds a bit vague, but it's the best way to explain it. I would see shadows standing outside, like person-shaped shadows just standing in the yard out of the corner of my eyes. And when I would look directly at them, they would vanish. I would see them standing inside the house, just inside the window. Mac hated walking by that house, probably for the same reason. Every time I would see them, it would send that freaky chill down my spine and make me just want to run. But I just shook it off as a trick of the light or me being tired. And no, I didn't even try to logically explain why Mac hated the place. Then, one night, it took a pretty sharp turn for the creepier. It was around 2 in the morning. I was working on something at my desk, and Mac came into my office whining, which meant that he wanted to go outside. With this house, at that time, our backyard was not fenced in, so we couldn't just let him go out back to do what he needed. We had to take him out. I figured that it was late enough that I could go ahead and shut off my computer, go for a quick walk with him, and then head to bed anyways. So, I grabbed his leash and we stepped outside for a quick walk. The street was completely silent, and there weren't many streetlights, so it was pretty dark outside. We walked down the street, and when we went to pass 405, Mac slowed down and started to growl. Mac was a super chill dog, so him growling was weird. I turned to look at where he was staring, and I could literally feel the hair on my arms start to stand on end. There, in the window of that house, was the clear silhouette of an old man. I could vaguely make out the details of his hair and face, but he seemed to be surrounded by those shadows that I would frequently see when walking by the house. He just stood there, watching us from the window and not moving. I felt a knot start to tighten in my stomach, and I just kind of stayed there watching this vague image of an old man stand there and watch me. After a few seconds, the lights that were on shut off, and I could see that there was nobody in the house. At that point, I was pretty well done with the whole thing. I grabbed Mac, and I rushed back to our home. I tried telling my wife about the whole thing, but she was pretty well out of it already, and she laughed, saying that I was being silly. I don't think I slept that night. I kept looking out the window of the house to see if I would see it again, but I didn't. It was a bit silly, I guess, but the next day when I got the chance, I actually asked one of the neighbors about the old man that lived there, and she told me that Harry, the man who had owned the house before passing away in 2018, was a bit of a grumpy and nosy old man. Apparently, he was well known for always staring out his window with an aggressive scowl as people walked past his house, and he would do so with the curtains wide open to make sure that you knew he was watching you. She also mentioned that he had major issues with people walking their dogs past his house, and he was known for being verbally aggressive towards them. With that, I assumed that the reason the shadows always seemed to show up when I was walking Mac past his house, and the reason I saw him that night, was because I had upset him. Even in death, Harry seemed like a bitter old man, and as much as that creeped me out, I really didn't want to deal with it again. After that night, we didn't walk past 405 at all. If Mac and I went for a walk, we would get to his property line, cross the street, and walk past his house. I never walked with Mac directly in front of his house again. Interestingly enough, I never really dealt with anything paranormal again after that. At least, not involving Harry's old house. I still notice the lights on randomly, but I don't pay it too much mind, because I don't think that has anything to do with me. That's just Harry being an active spirit. Sadly enough, Harry's old house is actually still empty, and I don't know if it's even on the market anymore. But I kind of pity anyone that does end up moving in there, as they'll be moving in with a very angry old man as a roommate. So, I know that my story is going to sound horribly cliché, but it did actually happen to me, and it's something that honestly scared me nearly to death. It's easy to look at a story and say, you should have done this or that, but to end up in the situation is a totally different story. At the time, I panicked, and I took the easiest way that I could to get out of the situation. And if I were in this situation again today, I think I would probably still do the same thing, as my potential stupid actions are most likely what saved my hide. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was living in the heart of the city, in an apartment that was only a few blocks from my office. I'm a night owl, always have been. There's something about being out in the world when it's completely still and silent that has always appealed to me. It was during one of these late nights, around 2 in the morning to be exact, that I was walking home from my office. It had been a particularly stressful day at work. I mean, obviously, I was leaving at 2. And I was looking forward to the cool night air to calm my nerves and to help me center myself a little bit. I took my usual route down the familiar sidewalk that was illuminated by the dim streetlights, past all the closed shops with their metal shutters down and locked, towards the local park that was always deserted this time of night. I will say that there is this strange and eerie peace that emanates from the deserted cityscape at night that I've just kind of always felt comforting. That is, until that night. As I was walking, I heard what sounded like soft rustling coming from behind me. I didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just a newspaper getting blown around in the wind, or maybe a stray cat doing stray cat things. As I continued walking, I noticed that it wasn't fading away. It was persistent, and it seemed like it was following me. I slowly pulled my pepper spray off my clip that was attached to my purse, and turned to see if there was someone there. And, sure enough, there was. About 30-ish feet behind me was a man in a hooded sweatshirt and gym shorts, walking at around the same pace that I was. His hood wasn't up, but he was doing everything he could to make it look like he was not looking at me. Looking down at the ground, turning slightly to the side. Now, I don't like to think the worst about anyone that I see, especially when I first see them. But the way he reacted to me turning around was not normal, and it put me on edge. I figured the best thing to do was to keep walking and to pay attention to how far he was from me the whole time. I didn't have that far to go to get to my apartment building, thankfully, and after a couple more moments of upping my pace a bit and putting a little extra distance between us, I came up to an alleyway that had the side entrance of my apartment building. At that point, I was faced with two options: make a run down the side alley and make it into the side door quickly, or take the chance and walk all the way around the building to the front to get into the front door. I decided that the side entrance being quicker and a straight shot was my best bet. As I approached the alley, I quickly turned and did a slight jog towards the door. When I turned back to see if he was following me down the alley, I was surprised to see that he was still just standing there and staring at me at the entrance. At this point, it was more than clear that he was definitely following me, and that he intended to make me the victim of whatever it was that he was plotting. I kept walking towards the door of my building, my key card in one hand and the pepper spray in the other, intending to get into the building quickly. When I approached the door, I heard a sound that sent me into overdrive. The sound of feet rapidly smacking onto the concrete. This guy was now running at me in a full sprint. I nearly fumbled everything as I beeped in with the keycard, stepped in and slammed the door shut behind me. Thankfully it was a good door, and thankfully it locked immediately when it shut after being beeped in, because as soon as I got to the other side of the door, the man was right there, his face pressed against the glass and staring at me. This guy really just stood there with his face literally pressed against the glass door, laughing and smiling at me. I turned back and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, until I got to my floor and my apartment. I actually called the police and reported the incident, but since he hadn't attempted to break in, there wasn't really anything they could do. The next day, I contacted the leasing office and they pulled the camera footage so that we could at least get a picture of the guy so that we could hang it up and warn the tenants about him, which we did. One of my neighbors mentioned that they had seen the guy standing outside of the building a few weeks prior, and that he had asked them for change. When they said no, he got mad and started yelling that whatever he ended up doing was going to be their fault. So, that was nice to know. Unfortunately, I've never really been able to forget that night. The fear that I felt as I turned to see him sprinting at me. I no longer walk from the office to my apartment, and actually moved to a different location a few months later for unrelated reasons. The whole thing was a chilling reminder of how a simple stroll from one place to another can quickly turn into a nightmare. That night, the city that I loved definitely showed me a darker side, one that I hope to never encounter again. Hey Raven, you're an amazing channel, and you do such a great job. Keep it up. Anyways, I live in the city, and I don't want to give my exact location. It's a pretty prominent city in the US, but it's expensive to live here now. But city life is the best. I can't ever imagine living in the country or in the suburbs somewhere else. I live, work, and I guess you could say that I play out here too. The area in the city that I'm in is pretty well known for having an active nightlife, and it isn't uncommon to see other people out at all hours of the night or early morning. You could say that I'm a fitness nut, so I go out to a local park for a jog nearly every single morning. I love getting out there for exercise. You know that stereotype that things only really happen at night? Well, I didn't think that things would happen around 8 to 9 a.m. There were people around walking their dogs or going to work or school. Despite things happening in other parts of the city, it's kind of unthinkable for where I live. Anyway, there was supposedly a group of men that was following women who were out alone all hours of the night. but I've never been the type of person to let someone force me out of something I enjoy. I decided to go for walks late at night with a friend, or a couple of friends at a time. I organized with them at a local corner store. Perfect. I headed off and waited. It isn't uncommon for my one friend to be late, but I'd been waiting till around 11 p.m. for close to 30 minutes. I tried calling and texting her to make sure she was okay. On the 5th try, she told me she was okay, but that she didn't feel like going out with me. I was mad at her, and I kind of told her off for it. I didn't want it to ruin my evening. I came out with a purpose, and I was going to stick to the plan. The park is fairly well lit and pretty safe. I could see some other people walking around at the time, so I wasn't really worried. I set off down the long path, listening to some music and just enjoying the cool air. I pondered starting a permanent habit of going out at this time by myself. I kept going. I was sweaty, and gradually the people started to become fewer and fewer. As I was walking, I heard what sounded like a scream, even though I was listening to my music. I stopped, took my earbuds out, and listened for any more sounds. I was right under a light and tried to look to see if I could see anyone nearby, and then I heard that distinct sound of a baby crying, and I waited to see if the baby would quiet down. But why would a baby be out at this time at night? Did something happen to the mother? I was too scared to call out. I slowly walked toward the sound, and the baby's cries got louder and louder. I saw a baby carrier, the kind that you place in a car near a blanket, and close to some trees. It looked really damn sus. I froze. I was unsure of whether I should check the baby or call the police first. If the baby died or something before I went over to look, I would have never forgiven myself. I jogged over, and I didn't see anyone, so I pulled the car seat back. It was covered in a blanket, and I pulled it away. There was a doll in the car seat with a small speaker taped around its neck. I let out a scream and backed away, nearly falling over in the process. I didn't see anyone hiding or anything. I didn't wait to find out if there was anyone there. I turned and ran as fast as I could out of the park and into a well-lit area. I could hear some people running behind me, and I could have sworn that I heard someone tell me to wait or stop. There was no way in hell that I was going to be stopping for anybody. It was only when I was at a nearby restaurant that I slowed down, and I told them what happened to me in the park. I don't know if this was a human trafficker or just people who wanted to rob me. Either way, someone who does something like this does not have good intentions. I should have called the police instead. I called the police afterwards, and I did report it. These sort of crimes happened in the rougher areas of town rather than where I lived. They were mainly robberies. I only go jogging with people now or during daylight to prevent these things from happening. The sad thing is, people stopped walking through the park as much, including me. It's said that the actions of a few can impact so many people. And what's worse, I used to feel so safe here. Every job out there has its challenges and its difficulties. But for some reason, part of me thought that the late shift at a local gas station in the small town that I live in wouldn't be that crazy. The job itself is fine. It's a fairly simple job that has me constantly restocking shelves until about 10, when I have to break down the store and clean everything. We certainly had some interesting people enter the store, people I didn't know even lived in my small town, but there was one incident that happened after a long shift that actually terrified me more than any of those. It was a pretty typical night. My shift ended at 1 in the morning, and I had spent the last few hours cleaning up the day's messes and getting everything in order for the overnight and early morning shift. I was tired. but I needed to still make the walk home. So, I put in my earphones and started down the same road that I always walked to get back. The night was pretty much silent. Nothing going on, as is the normal for 1 in the morning. I'd walked this same path hundreds of times, and I've never had any issues, so I will admit that I let my guard down. Because it's not a terribly long walk. And like I said, there's usually no one out that late at night. I was about halfway home when I saw what looked like a beam of light click on ahead of me and shine in my direction. No big deal, really. Just someone else out going for a walk, I assumed. I kept walking the way I was going, which was towards the light. But then I heard what sounded like someone yelling through the podcast I was listening to. I paused it, and I pulled my earphones out to be absolutely sure I was hearing someone yelling, and not just thinking I was hearing it. Sure enough, I was. The guy that was holding the flashlight was yelling something like, "Hey, are you even listening to me?" I apologized and mentioned that I had my earphones in, and then asked, "Do you need something?" He then said, "Yeah, I want you to come here." Obviously, that wasn't something I was planning on doing. I responded by asking him what it was that he needed from me, and he started on a tirade. He started screaming about how I needed to come there right now, and that I needed to help him because it was my job. I kindly responded with, "I'm sorry, I think you have me mistaken for someone else. I'm trying to walk home." Then came the profanities and names. This guy started calling me every inappropriate and unsavory title that he had ever heard, yelling about how I was required to help him if he asked, and that everything was my fault. I started to back up a bit when I saw that the light was getting closer, but how much danger I was in didn't really click until he got under one of the streetlights. I originally thought that this was just some random person, and he thought that I was someone else. But when I saw him under the light, I was certain that this guy was not all there. This man had been chewed up and spit out by life. His clothes were torn up, his hair was horribly messy, he was limping and stomping on the concrete with bare feet, and his face was sunken in and bright red. The thing about him that really caught my attention, though, was the broken glass bottle that he was gripping in the hand that wasn't holding the flashlight. I nearly froze in fear as this guy was walking towards me, but it quickly occurred to me that if I just stood there, this guy was going to use that bottle. I spun on my heels and took off back towards the gas station at a full sprint. I could hear him continuing to shout threats at me, and just screaming seemingly random things that made no sense. I turned to look back once, and he was still coming towards me, but he wasn't running. He hadn't picked up the pace at all, so thankfully I had put some distance between us. Out of breath and still shaking, I made it back to the gas station. My coworker was surprised to see me, but I mentioned what happened, and he told me that I should call someone to come get me, and just stay there in case the guy showed up at the station. I agreed, and I ended up spending way too much money on an Uber. As they pulled up, and I climbed into the back seat, I actually saw the guy. He was standing on the corner of the street, just huddled there, and rocking back and forth. It was pretty clear that this guy was not okay. And clearly he needed help, but why did he lash out at me? Was it just a random act of aggression? I'm guessing that I was probably just the unlucky soul that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he decided that I needed to be the target of his anger. I did make it home all right. No other issues, obviously. I mentioned it to my manager the next day, just in case the guy did come into the store and decide to be a problem there. I also changed up my route to get home at night, heading up a block or two north and then heading west. It added a few extra minutes, but it's been pretty calm. I haven't seen him again, and I hope that he got help, but honestly, there was nothing that I could do for him. And I'm obviously thankful that he didn't decide to run after me, and that nothing more happened during this encounter. This is the first time that I've ever sent a story in. My life has been pretty boring in comparison to some other people's, so I hope that my story is something that you can use. My doctor told me that I needed to start exercising more because of my health. Where I live, it gets extremely hot during the day, even during winter, so working out at nighttime is just easier. I was still too embarrassed to go to the gym to exercise, and I didn't want to be judged. I decided to go for walks at nighttime when it was cooler and that there would be fewer people out. Even then, there were still other people out, and while it may have been safer, I still felt really self-conscious. On a whim, I decided to go for a walk at 1 in the morning, so technically I guess it was early morning. This was also quite a long time ago. I didn't have a cell phone with me that I could take. I went for a walk and naturally there wasn't anyone around. Over time, I was getting used to and enjoying my night walks. My neighborhood is normally quiet and has a reputation for being one of the safer ones. I walked a good distance away from my house, and only the occasional car drove by. Occasionally, I would get a honk of hello by one of my neighbors, and I would wave back. There were some parked cars along both sides of the street, but this was nothing abnormal, nor did it draw my attention or cause me to be concerned. I continued on my way when I saw a car slowly driving behind me. The lights were on. I gave a wave thinking it was someone who knew me, and perhaps they decided to play a prank on me. After a while, though, I started getting a terrible feeling that they did not have good intentions towards me, and I tried to stay in well-lit areas where I would be safe. I was about halfway home, and I wanted to get home as soon as possible, but I didn't want to lead whoever this was back to my house, just in case they decided to come back later on or whatever they were planning on doing. There was a local servo, or gas station, nearby that's open 24 hours, and I started to walk in the direction of it. I knew there would be someone there, and I would be able to get some help. I kept checking behind me, and sure enough, the car kept following. I tried changing directions to see what the person would do. They changed lines and kept following me. I saw a glimpse of a man in the car, but I couldn't really distinguish any of his facial features. I was beginning to get incredibly scared now, but I kept a level head. I walked to the servo, entered, and spoke to the man behind the counter. I told him that this car had been following me. We looked outside for the car, but it was gone. At first, I was relieved, but it was only when we looked around the corner that we again saw the car, waiting for me to come out. The lights were off this time, and he was clearly trying to hide. The man was so kind and called the police for me. I waited and actually bought some snacks. Counterproductive to my diet, but I needed the comfort because I was so nervous. I'm not sure how long it took for the police to come, but when they came, the other car drove away and I didn't see them again. I still went on my regular walks, but I ended up going with a friend to keep me company and for safety reasons. I never leave without a mobile phone in case of an emergency now, and actually bought one as soon as this happened. There was an update on the car that followed me. It had actually been stolen. There were women who were walking who had gone missing in the neighboring towns who were grabbed when they were walking, either in the early morning or late at night. There were rumors that it was some kind of serial killer or something, but since there were no bodies or anything, we couldn't really be sure if this was true. From what I heard about these women, they weren't the sort to just get up and leave their families behind. So, yeah, it probably isn't good. The OP actually emailed me after sending this story to me for an update. Hey, sorry about the second email. I wanted to give you an update about my story, and I hadn't heard it on your channel yet. I did some extra digging and found out that one of those missing women who went out for a late night walk had actually been found deceased, and was likely the victim of a murder. The others who had gone missing hadn't been found yet. There isn't anything specific to say it was the same person, or if it was connected. But it made me wonder what could have happened, so I guess going to that servo was a good idea. Anyways, stay safe out there. So, that, my friends, was a collection of scary late night walk stories. Scary stories that occur during late night walks. Walking late at night, scary stories that occur during this act. Was this collection? Yeah. Definitely some real creepy stories. Not all of them people. One of them is at least paranormal, so that's interesting. All scary, though. All terrifying. Genuinely terrifying. Hopefully you all enjoyed this collection of scary stories. And if you did, consider hitting the thumbs up button, as that helps the channel tremendously. You can also subscribe if you're new to the channel and liked what you heard. And if you're feeling ever so bold, go below the video and leave me a comment. Let me know. How are you doing? How's it going? Any plans for this weekend? I don't have any plans. I'm just going to do standard Raven weekend stuff. As we do. Yeah. Anyways, friends. The other thing you could do is Patreon members, early access, super thanks, support the channel further, never expected, always appreciated. You get the gist of it. I've said it somewhere close to 500 times at this point, so yeah. I do hope you're all having a beautiful day. I hope your week is going very well for you, and I hope I do see you again here very soon. But, till then, remember you are loved. You are valid, you are important, you're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise, and please do not forget it. And my friends, until next time, much love, and sleep well.